Last episode, you might remember, President Biden joined us as we looked back on Andrew Johnson, America's 17th president. You're tuned into the Democracy Channel, where we break down the past and keep a watchful eye on the present with our Executive Order Watch. Now let's turn the page from Johnson to another towering figure who led the Union to victory. It's time to meet Ulysses S. Grant. But before we dive in, let's take a quick look and see what President Biden's up to today.
Folks, I want to talk to you about a man who helped hold the country together at one of its most fragile moments. General, Commander, President. Ulysses S. Grant, our 18th president, was a quiet warrior with a steel spine. He didn't speak a lot, but when he did, people listened. And when he acted, he changed the course of history. After leading the Union Army to victory in the Civil War, Grant didn't seek power. He took on the burden of healing a wounded nation. He fought not with cannon or saber this time, but with the power of the presidency. To rebuild, to reunite, to protect the rights of every American. Let's be clear, Grant was popular, one of the most celebrated figures of his day. Massive crowds turned out to see him wherever he went. Around the world, they called him the hero of the Republic. But his legacy isn't just in parades or portraits. It's in the very foundation of civil rights protections, in how we view the presidency during times of national trial, and in our commitment to defending democracy, here at home and around the world. He faced criticism, like all of us who sit in that big office do. But through economic hardship, political strife, and the long shadow of war, he held firm to the ideals of liberty and union. And today, when we talk about the power of perseverance, the courage to do what's right even when it's not easy, we're still talking about Ulysses S. Grant. So, let's take a moment to recognize the man, the myth, and the enduring mission. Because as the general himself might say, "For democracy I live for democracy I die for."
Good day. My name is Ulysses S. Grant, soldier, general, and the 18th President of the United States. I was born on April 27, 1822, in a modest log cabin in Ohio. My birth name was Hiram Ulysses Grant, but a clerical error at West Point turned me into Ulysses S. Grant, and that name stayed with me through the rest of my life. I spent my youth hauling wood, working my father's farm, and learning horsemanship. Though I never intended a military career, I graduated from West Point in 1843 and fought in the Mexican-American War. Years later, when the Civil War erupted, I was clerking in my father's leather shop in Galena, Illinois. When called, I answered. As a Union general, I led campaigns at Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, campaigns that ultimately split the Confederacy and brought Robert E. Lee to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. President Lincoln entrusted me with the highest command in the land. After the war, my popularity propelled me to the presidency in 1868. I served 2 terms, from 1869 to 1877, leading the nation through Reconstruction. My presidency, policies and actions. I took office when Americans were weary of war, desperate to reunite the nation and protect the rights of newly freed people. I supported the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing African American men the right to vote. I enforced Reconstruction with federal troops where necessary, determined that former Confederates not undo the Union's victory. At the same time, I worked to stabilize the economy, supported the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, and signed legislation creating the Department of Justice to fight the Ku Klux Klan's violence. But I must confess, my administration was marred by scandal. Though I never profited personally, I appointed friends and loyalists who betrayed my trust. The most notorious example was the Whiskey Ring, a conspiracy of officials who siphoned millions in tax revenue. Executive orders and proclamations. Ascendancy, I issued 217 executive orders, addressing matters from Reconstruction to civil service. Some notable actions. executive orders regulating Indian affairs, establishing reservations, and negotiating land cessions. Actions that, for better or worse, shaped the fate of tribes in the West. Proclamation 203, 1870. Declared martial law in parts of South Carolina to suppress Ku Klux Klan terror. Proclamation 206. 1871. Announced that public lands in Alabama would be reserved for homesteads and schools. Proclamation 212. 1872. Opened millions of acres in Nebraska and Kansas for settlement. These land policies spurred migration westward, but came at enormous cost to native peoples whose homelands were seized or partitioned. Later, life after leaving office, I circled the globe with my wife Julia, welcomed by emperors and common citizens alike. But my final years were marked by hardship. A failed investment wiped out my savings, and I was diagnosed with throat cancer. Determined to leave something for my family, I wrote my personal memoirs as death drew near. Those pages earned more money than I'd ever seen and preserved the memory of a life of service. When people look back on my life, they often see only Appomattox and Lee's surrender. But I tell you plainly, the Union's victory was forged along the rivers and railroads of the West. In January 1862, I saw the Confederates perched behind Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, two strongholds that barred our way into Tennessee. My superiors were skeptical when I proposed a joint Army-Navy expedition to seize them, but I persisted. We struck quickly. The gunboats battered Fort Henry into submission by February 6th. At Donelson, I led 15,000 men into a freezing siege. The cold was brutal, rain, snow, mud, hunger. Yet my men never wavered. When the enemy tried to break out, I counterattacked and closed in on their lines. The Confederate commander proposed a truce. My answer was clear. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. On February 16th, Fort Donelson fell, yielding over 14,000 prisoners and dozens of cannon, the first decisive Union victory of the war. It flung open the rivers that carried supplies, troops, and rail lines deep into enemy territory. I pushed toward Nashville without waiting for orders, determined to keep momentum. That urgency unsettled Washington, and for a time I was stripped of command, accused of moving without permission. But soon enough, the Confederacy's buildup near Corinth, Mississippi, demanded my return. At Shiloh, on April 6, 1862, 50,000 Confederates struck at dawn. They drove my army back to the riverbank. That night, I took shelter under a tree in the rain rather than watch the agony of the wounded. Come dawn, we counterattacked. With fresh troops under Buell, we hurled the enemy back. They retreated to Corinth, 19 miles away. This costly victory opened the South's heartland. From then on, it was a war of rivers, rails, and relentless pressure. People forget the war was not won by battles alone. It was won by supply lines, rails laid across Tennessee mud, bridges thrown over rivers, warehouses packed with rations. I advanced south, securing Memphis and reinforcing our rail depots. When the Confederates struck back at Corinth, they were thrown back and scattered at the Hatchie River. I proposed as early as October 1862 to march on Vicksburg, the last Confederate bastion on the Mississippi. To take it, we needed a vast logistical network, railroads to bring ammunition and hardtack, river flotillas to move men and artillery, telegraph lines to coordinate attacks. In November, I seized Grand Junction and La Grange. By December, my cavalry had ridden down to Holly Springs. We pressed south, inch by inch, linking our advance to the iron rails that tied north to south. But the enemy struck back. Confederate raiders overran Holly Springs, burning warehouses and capturing supplies. Our advance stalled. I learned a harsh lesson. No campaign could succeed without secure logistics. From that day on, I never again assumed a supply line was safe. They've put my likeness on a $50 bill, and in more films than I can count on one hand and still hold a cigar. History hasn't always agreed on who I was, but the screen certainly had its say. Let me recount the roll call. In The Birth of a Nation, 1915, they used me to justify reconciliation, not truth. In Abraham Lincoln, 1930, I was but a silent witness to a towering friend. By They Died with Their Boots On, 1941, I was humble, almost naive, opposite Errol Flynn's Custer. Hollywood loves a contrast. In Spielberg's Lincoln, 2012, I wore the weight of war and reunion. Jared Harris gave me grit and quiet fire. In Wild Wild West, 1999, well, I was played for laughs by Kevin Kline. I've never operated a mechanical spider, for the record. And Jonah Hex, 2010. Let's just say I've never enlisted a bounty hunter to fight dark magic. The smaller screens remembered me too. In Hell on Wheels, I was weary but watchful. In Timeless and Legends of Tomorrow, I time traveled. Imagine that, a general learning to use a wristwatch. There was Grant, 2020, where Justin Salinger portrayed me earnestly. That was closer. He saw the farmer and the fighter, the triumphs and the tumors. All in all, they've painted me as everything from a drunk to a saint, a tactician, a bystander, a symbol. And that's fine. I was all those things, and sometimes none of them. But I'll leave you with this. I never asked to be remembered with flair. I only asked to be remembered fairly. And if celluloid and cable reruns help some schoolchild learn what held the Union together, I suppose I'll share the spotlight with Lincoln and Lee once more. They've put my likeness on a $50 bill, and in more films than I can count on one hand, and still hold a cigar. History hasn't always agreed on who I was, but the screen certainly had its say. Let me recount the roll call. In The Birth of a Nation, 1915, they used me to justify reconciliation, not truth. In Abraham Lincoln, 1930, I was but a silent witness to a towering friend. By They Died with Their Boots On, 1941, I was humble, almost naive, opposite Errol Flynn's Custer. Hollywood loves a contrast. In Spielberg's Lincoln, 2012, I wore the weight of war and reunion. Jared Harris gave me grit and quiet fire. In Wild Wild West, 1999, well, I was played for laughs by Kevin Kline. I've never operated a mechanical spider, for the record. And Jonah Hex, 2010. Let's just say I've never enlisted a bounty hunter to fight dark magic. The smaller screens remembered me too. In Hell on Wheels, I was weary but watchful. In Timeless and Legends of Tomorrow, I time traveled. Imagine that, a general learning to use a wristwatch. There was Grant, 2020, where Justin Salinger portrayed me earnestly. That was closer. He saw the farmer and the fighter, the triumphs and the tumors. All in all, they've painted me as everything from a drunk to a saint, a tactician, a bystander, a symbol. And that's fine. I was all those things, and sometimes none of them. But I'll leave you with this. I never asked to be remembered with flair. I only asked to be remembered fairly. And if celluloid and cable reruns help some schoolchild learn what held the Union together, I suppose I'll share the spotlight with Lincoln and Lee once more.
And that's it. Or so you thought. Because General Ulysses S. Grant didn't just command armies, he conquered the screen too. And while we've already seen 34 portrayals, history had a few more credits to roll. Let's take a quick encore. Sherman's March 2007, Timeless 2016, Legends of Tomorrow 2016, and Abraham Lincoln 2022, where Grant returned with the same steel-eyed resolve. From silent films to sci-fi time jumps, Grant's legacy has marched across genres, decades, and imaginations, sometimes solemn, sometimes stylized, but always unforgettable. We hope you've learned something, maybe a little about the man, a little more about the myth, and a whole lot about how America tells its stories. Because remember, for democracy I live, for democracy I die, for. Now let's keep that spirit marching forward. Coming up next, let's learn a bit about the big, beautiful bill that carries General Grant's legacy in the palm of your hand.
Limiting who can qualify, lowering reimbursement rates, and cutting back on services that go beyond the federal minimum. And here's one that's making headlines: banning federal payments to certain providers. This clause targets prohibited entities, which could include organizations that provide abortion services, depending on how states interpret the law. The exact impact is still unclear, but it opens the door to broader restrictions on where people can receive care, especially low-income women. The next set of rules go after financing strategies that states have used for years. Things like provider taxes or state-directed payments. Basically, creative ways states use federal matching funds are now facing new restrictions. Some states rely heavily on these mechanisms to keep their Medicaid budgets balanced, so tightening them could cause ripple effects on access and services. There's also a new requirement that Medicaid demonstration projects, these are state-level experiments with new care models, must now be budget neutral. That's not totally new, but the language here gives federal authorities more power to enforce it. So states won't be able to pilot new ideas unless they can prove up front that it won't cost more. And finally, this section introduces community engagement requirements, also known as work requirements, for certain Medicaid recipients. States must now require certain adults to work, volunteer, or participate in approved activities in order to maintain coverage. This doesn't apply to everyone. There are exemptions, but for adults without dependents or disabilities, it's a big shift. The idea is that people should contribute if they can, but critics argue it often punishes those with unstable job situations or limited transportation options. They're also tightening cost-sharing rules. That means more people could be required to pay small amounts, co-pays, or premiums to stay enrolled in Medicaid. It's not a huge dollar amount per person, but for people living paycheck to paycheck, it could be just enough to push them off the program. So overall, this section is all about stricter oversight, tighter eligibility, and more pressure on states to cut costs. Supporters say it'll make Medicaid more efficient and accountable. But for people trying to navigate the system, especially those with limited income or shifting circumstances, these changes could make it harder to stay covered or even to get enrolled in the first place.
Yeah, this movie
This
just
section
started. It's
comes
called
from Title
Jackpot. They
7,
supposed to kill
Subtitle
the
8,
person who
Chapters
has the
1 and 2
jackpot
of the book. It's
lotto.
all about taxes, specifically cutting them for the middle class, families
Yeah.
with kids, and yes, seniors. There's been a lot of political talk about this being a tax relief plan for working Americans, and some of that's true. But when you actually read the details, you start to see where the benefits land and where they don't. There are some permanent cuts, some temporary boosts, and a few new ideas like removing taxes on tips and overtime pay. But there are also limits, trade-offs, and income thresholds that could quietly leave some folks out. So let's start with the basics. The standard deduction, which is the amount you can subtract from your income before taxes are calculated, is staying high. That's good news for most taxpayers. It's especially helpful for people who don't itemize their deductions, and that includes a lot of retirees. The bill locks in this increased standard deduction, so it doesn't shrink back down in a few years like it was originally set to. Now here's something more specific to seniors. There's a temporary senior deduction being carved out. While the bill removes most personal exemptions across the board, it makes an exception for seniors by allowing a special deduction just for them. That means if you're 65 or older, you'll still get a break that younger taxpayers won't. But it's important to know that this senior deduction phases out at higher income levels. So if you're a retiree with a decent pension, investments, or other income, you might not qualify for the full amount. And guess what? They're also adjusting the child tax credit again. This one's interesting because it's being expanded, and it'll now include a more generous formula that makes it easier to qualify for the full credit, especially for families with more than one child. The phase-out thresholds are still there, but the credit itself is bigger, and more of it is refundable, meaning you can get money back even if you don't owe taxes. That's a win for lower-income families. The qualified business income deduction is also being extended. This one's mostly for small business owners, freelancers, and people with side income. If you run a small LLC, work as an independent contractor, or have rental income, you may have already been using this deduction. Under the bill, it sticks around with some tweaks to the income caps and limits. And now for something a little newer, no tax on tips. If you earn money in tips, like restaurant workers, hairstylists, valet drivers, this part's going to stand out. The bill proposes eliminating income taxes on tipped wages. Sounds simple, but it's actually a pretty big shift in how the IRS handles reported income. This could increase take-home pay for millions of workers, especially in hospitality and service jobs. But of course, we'll have to see how the IRS plans to enforce it or prevent abuse. Right next to that is another headline piece: no tax on overtime. If you're an hourly worker who puts in more than 40 hours, the extra money you earn for that overtime wouldn't be taxed under this bill. That's designed to reward hard work and incentivize people to take extra shifts. The catch is there may be income caps that limit who gets this benefit. So if your regular wages plus your overtime push you above a certain threshold, you might not get the full break. And then there's this one: no tax on car loan interest. If you're financing a vehicle, the interest you pay on that loan could be tax deductible under this bill. That's a new idea meant to ease the burden of high auto loan rates. But again, there's fine print. You'll likely have to choose between this deduction and others, depending on how you file. And it probably won't apply to luxury vehicles. Another major piece is the creation of Trump accounts, which are being introduced as government-seeded savings or investment accounts for eligible individuals. The idea here is to encourage long-term savings, especially among young people and new parents. For a set period, qualifying families could get up to $1,000 seeded by the government into these accounts. That money could grow over time, similar to a Roth IRA or education savings account, but it would come with restrictions on how and when it could be used. Supporters say this is about building wealth from the bottom up. Critics argue that a one-time $1,000 contribution doesn't go far, especially for families struggling to make rent or cover groceries. And while it's being framed as a benefit for the middle class, the income phase-outs and limits could keep lower-income households from getting the full advantage. And something a lot of folks miss: many of the big deductions that used to exist before 2017 are still not coming back. Things like miscellaneous itemized deductions or the full state and local tax deduction are still limited. That means if you live a high-tax state like California, New York, or New Jersey, you might not see a huge tax cut when all is said and done. There's also a cap on how much value you can get from itemized deductions overall. So even if you're donating to charity, paying mortgage interest, or dealing with large medical bills, your deductions might be limited based on your income level. A few other updates tucked in here. The bill keeps the ABLE account benefits, which help people with disabilities save money without losing access to federal aid. It extends the ability to roll over from a 529 college savings plan into an ABLE account too. That's a helpful bridge for families who save for college, but later realized the funds would be better used for disability-related expenses. And there's a continuation of the policy that allows student loans discharged due to death or disability to be excluded from taxable income. This was originally passed during COVID relief efforts, and now it's being made permanent. So yeah, there's a lot packed into this section. On paper, it's a big tax cut for working families, seniors, and small businesses. But the structure favors people who already have some financial stability. If your income is too low, you might not benefit from deductions because you don't owe enough taxes to begin with. If your income is too high, you might phase out of eligibility. And that middle ground, that's where the bill is really aiming. People who work full-time, earn enough to owe taxes, but not so much that they lose the credits. Seniors who still file returns, but don't have large retirement incomes. Families with multiple kids and two earners. For those groups, this could offer real relief. For everyone else, it may feel like a mixed bag. This section is part of Title VII, Chapter 2, and Chapter 4. It expands on some of the tax changes we talked about earlier, but with a specific focus on families, children, and savings. A lot of these policies are framed as ways to help working parents, caregivers, and future generations build a better financial foundation. And at the center of it all is something new: the Trump account. You'll hear a lot about this in the coming months, so It's worth understanding what it actually is, how it works, and what kind of impact it could really have. So, the Trump account, officially called a contribution pilot program, is a new government-backed savings tool. It's designed to automatically deposit up to $1,000 for every qualifying child born between 2025 and 2029. That money would go into a special investment account controlled by the child's family, and it's meant to grow over time.
It was a pleasure having you here today, and I truly hope you learned a bit about the big beautiful bill and what it could mean for our country. Remember, for democracy I live for democracy I die for. Stay informed, stay active, and I'll see you next time right here on the Democracy Channel.